Well, gentlemen, when I was alone again, I thought a lot about this visitor and his unusual request. Of course, I was glad in a way, because the money he had offered was at least 10 times as much as the ordinary pay for such a piece of work. And it was possible that this opportunity would lead to others. But the face and manner of this man had given me a strange feeling, and I did not believe that the story of the Fuller's Earth really explained the necessity for a midnight visit, or the conditions of extreme secrecy that were connected with it. But I put my fears to one side, ate a large supper, drove to Paddington, and started off for Aford. I had obeyed Captain Stark's instructions and had spoken to nobody. At Reading, I had to change stations, and I caught the last train to Aford. I reached the dark little station after 11 o'clock. I was the only passenger who got out there, and the only person at the station was a single sleepy railwayman, holding an oil lamp. As I passed through the gate from the station, I found Captain Stark waiting in the shadows on the other side of the road. Without speaking, he seized me by the arm and hurried me into a carriage. He pulled up the windows on both sides, knocked on the woodwork as a signal to the driver, and we set off as fast as the horse could go. "One horse?" Holmes interrupted. "Yes, only one." "Did you notice what colour it was?" "Yes. I saw by the light of the carriage lamps as I was stepping in. It was light brown." "Was it tired-looking or fresh?" "Oh, its coat looked quite fresh." "Thank you. I am sorry to have interrupted you. Please, continue your very interesting story." We drove for at least an hour. Captain Stark had said that it was only about 7 miles, but the time the journey took and the speed at which we travelled made me think it was really 10 or 12. He sat at my side in silence, watching me carefully all the time. The country roads must have been rather bad, as the carriage shook and moved violently up and down as we went along. I tried to look out of the windows to see where we were, but they were made of coloured glass, and I could see nothing except occasional faint lights. Now and then I spoke to the captain, but he answered only yes or no, and the conversation went no further. At last, the shaking of the carriage stopped, and we drove over a smooth private road. Our journey was over. Captain Stark jumped out, and, as I followed, pulled me quickly through the open front door of the house. We stepped right out of the carriage into the hall, so that I was quite unable to get any idea of what the outside of the house looked like. As soon as I was inside the house, the door was shut violently behind us, and I heard the faint sound of wheels as the carriage drove away. It was completely dark inside the house, and the captain began looking for matches, talking to himself as he did so. Suddenly, a door opened at the other end of the passage, and a golden beam of light appeared. It grew wider, and I saw a woman with a lamp, which she held above her head, pushing her face forward to look at us. I could see that she was pretty and expensively dressed. She said a few words in a foreign language, and when my companion answered with a single cold word, his reply gave her such a shock that she nearly dropped the lamp. Captain Stark went up to her, whispered something in her ear, and pushed her back into the room she had come out of. Then he walked back towards me with the lamp in his hand and opened the door of another room. "Please be kind enough to wait in this room for a few minutes," he said. It was a small plain room with a round table in the center. There were several German books scattered on this table. The captain put the lamp down on a smaller table by the door. "I will not keep you waiting long," he said, and disappeared into the darkness. I looked at the books on the table, and although I do not understand German, I could see that 2 of them were on scientific subjects. The others were books of poetry. Then I walked across to the window, hoping to see a little of the surroundings of the house. But strong, heavy boards were nailed across the window on the outside. It was an unusually silent house. The only sound came from an old clock somewhere in the passage. I felt myself becoming more and more anxious. Who were these German people? And what were they doing, living in this strange, out-of-the-way place? And where was the place? I only knew that it was 10 or 12 miles from Aford, but I had no idea whether it was north, south, east, or west. Of course, Reading, and possibly other large towns, were about the same distance away, but the complete stillness made it clear that Captain Stark's house was right out in the country. I walked anxiously up and down the room, singing to myself under my breath to give myself courage, and feeling that I was thoroughly earning my £50. Then, without a sound, the door of the room swung slowly open, and I saw the woman standing there. Behind her was the darkness of the hall, and the yellow light from my lamp shone on her eager and beautiful face. It was easy to see that she was in a state of extreme fear, and as a result, my own blood turned to ice. She held up one shaking finger to warn me to be silent. Her eyes, as she looked back into the dark passage, were like those of a frightened horse.
"You must go away,"
she whispered, in broken English, with an effort to speak calmly.
"There is no good here for you to do."
"But I have not yet done what I came to do. I cannot possibly leave until I have seen the machine."
"You will gain nothing by staying,"
she went on.
"You can pass through the door. Nobody prevents you."
And then, seeing that I only smiled and shook my head, she suddenly gave up her attempt to speak calmly and took a step forward.
"For the love of heaven,"
she said, stretching out her hands towards me,
"get away from here before it is too late."
But it is not easy to make me change my mind, and difficulties only make me more determined. I thought of my £50, of the tiring journey I had just made, and of the unpleasant night that was just beginning. Must all this be completely wasted? Why should I run away without carrying out my orders, and without receiving my pay for the night's work? Maybe this woman was crazy. Though her warning had worried me, I still shook my head firmly, and said I would stay. She would have gone on trying to persuade me, but just then we heard the noisy closing of a door upstairs, and the sound of footsteps on the stairs. She listened for a moment, threw up her hands in hopelessness, and then disappeared as suddenly and silently as she had come. When Captain Stark came back into the room, there was another man with him. This second man was short and fat, with a beard like a goat's growing out of the folds of his round face. The captain introduced him to me as Mr. Ferguson. "Mr. Ferguson is my secretary and manager," said the captain. Then he gave me a strange look and said, "Mr. Hatherley, I had the idea that I left this door shut just now." "Yes," I replied, "but the room seemed a little airless, and so I opened the door to let some air in. Well, perhaps we had better begin our business now. Mr. Ferguson and I will take you up to see the machine." "I had better put my hat on, I suppose," I said. "Oh no, it is in the house." "What? Do you dig fuller's earth in the house?" "No, no. This is only where we press it into bricks. But never mind that. All we wish you to do is to examine the machine
and to let us know what is wrong with it."
We went upstairs together, the captain first, with the lamp, the fat manager and myself behind him. It was the kind of old house in which it would be easy to get lost. Full of passages, narrow stairways, and little low doors. There were no floor coverings, and above the ground floor there seemed to be no furniture at all. I tried to appear calm and cheerful, but I had not forgotten the warnings of the lady, and I watched my two companions anxiously. Ferguson appeared to be a bad-tempered and silent man, but I could tell from his voice that he was at least an Englishman. At last, Captain Stark stopped outside a low door, which he unlocked. The room inside was small and square, so small, in fact, that the three of us could hardly have gone inside at the same time. Ferguson remained outside, and I went in with the captain.
"We are now," he said, "actually inside the press, and it would be extremely unpleasant for us if anyone turned it on. The ceiling of this little room is really the moving part of the press, and it comes down with very great force on this metal floor. The machine still works, but it seems to be sticking, and it has lost some of its power. I should like you to examine it, please, and to show us how we can put it right." I took the lamp from him and examined the machine very thoroughly. It was certainly a very large and powerful one. When I went back outside and pressed down the handles that controlled it, I could tell from the soft whistling sound that there was a slight escape of water from one part into another. This was the explanation for the loss of pressure. A further examination showed that one of the rubber seals in the press had become worn and thin, and this was how the water was escaping. I pointed this out to my companions, who listened very carefully to what I said, and asked several questions about what they should do to put the problem right. When I had made it clear to them, I went back inside the machine and had another good look at it, to satisfy my own desire to find out what it was. I realized that the story of the Fuller's Earth was a complete lie. It was impossible to believe that such a powerful machine could be intended for such a purpose. The walls were made of wood, but the floor was like a kind of iron bath. When I examined this more closely, I saw that it was coated with another sort of metal, in a fine powder. I had bent down and was feeling this to find out exactly what it was, when I heard a few angry words in German and saw the captain looking down at me. "What are you doing in there?"
he asked. I was feeling angry with him for telling me lies.
"I was admiring your Fuller's Earth," I said.
"I think you ought to have told me the real purpose of your machine before asking me to advise you about it." As soon as I had spoken, I wished I had not. A cold, hard expression came into Captain Stark's face, and I saw that his grey eyes were full of hatred.
"Very well,"
he said.
"I will show you everything about the machine."
He took a step backwards, shut the little door, and quickly turned the key. I rushed towards it and pulled at the handle. Then I pushed and kicked at the door, but it held firm.
"Captain Stark! Captain Stark!"
I shouted.
"Let me out!"
And then, suddenly, in the silence, I heard a sound that sent my heart to my mouth with fear. It was the controlling handles being pressed down, and the slight whistling noise of the water. Captain Stark had turned on the machine. The lamp was still on the iron floor of the press, and by its light I saw that the black ceiling was coming down on me, slowly and unsteadily, but with enough power to crush me into the floor. With a terrible cry, I threw myself against the door and tore with my nails at the lock.
I begged the captain to let me out, but the sounds of the machinery drowned my cries. The ceiling was now only a foot or two above my head, and by raising my arm I could feel its hard, rough surface. Then the thought struck me that the pain of my death would depend very much on the position of my body at the last moment. If I lay on my face, the weight would come on my backbone, and I trembled to think of the terrible sound of my own back breaking. Perhaps it would be easier the other way, but had I enough courage to lie and look up at that fearful black shadow as it came nearer and nearer? Already I was unable to stand up when I noticed something that brought hope back to my heart. I have said that though the floor and the ceiling were made of iron, the walls of the press were wooden. As I gave a last, hopeless look around, I saw a thin line of yellow light between two of the boards, and this line became wider and wider as a small door was pushed backwards. For a moment I could hardly believe that here was a door that led away from death. The next moment I threw myself through and lay half fainting on the other side. The door had closed again behind me, but the crash of the lamp as the ceiling struck it, and a few moments afterwards the sound of the top and bottom of the press meeting, made me realize what a narrow escape I had had. Suddenly, as I lay outside the press, I felt somebody pulling at my wrist, and I saw that I was on the stone floor of a narrow passage, and a woman with an oil lamp in her hand was bending over me. It was the same good friend whose earlier warning I had so stupidly failed to take seriously. "Come, come," she cried. "They will be here in a moment. They will see that you are not there. Oh, do not waste valuable time, but come with me." This time, at least, I took her advice. Unsteadily, I stood up and ran with her along the passage and down a narrow staircase which led to another broad passage. Just as we reached this second passage, we heard the sound of running feet and the shouting of two voices, one answering the other, from the floor where we were and from the one below. My guide stopped and looked around her, as if she did not know what to do. Then she threw open a door which led into a bedroom, through the window of which the moon was shining brightly. "It is your only chance," she said. "The window is high up, but perhaps you can jump out." As she spoke, a light appeared at the other end of the passage, and I saw the thin figure of Captain Stark rushing forward with a lamp in one hand and an axe in the other. I rushed across the bedroom, threw open the window, and looked out. How quiet and pleasant the garden looked in the moonlight. It was about 30 feet down. I climbed out, but did not jump immediately, as I wanted to hear what was about to happen between Stark and the lady who had saved me from death. If it were necessary, I was determined, whatever the risk, to return and help her. This thought had hardly flashed through my mind before he was at the door, pushing his way past her. But she threw her arms around him and tried to hold him back. "Fritz! Fritz, remember your promise after the last time," she cried in English. "You said it would never happen again. He will not tell anyone. Oh, I'm sure he will not." "You are crazy, Elise," he shouted, struggling to free himself. "You will be the ruin of us. He has seen too much. Let me pass, I say." He pushed her to one side, rushed to the window, and struck at me with his axe. At that moment, I was hanging by my hands to the bottom of the window. I was conscious of a dull pain, and I fell into the garden below. I was not hurt too much by the fall, so I got to my feet and rushed off among the bushes as fast as I could run. I knew that I was not out of danger yet. Suddenly, as I ran, I began to feel sick and faint. I looked down at my hand, which by now was really painful, and saw for the first time that my thumb had been cut off, and that blood was pouring from the wound. I attempted to tie a piece of cloth round it, but suddenly I seemed to hear a strange singing noise in my ears, and the next moment I fainted and fell. I do not know how long I remained unconscious. It must have been a very long time, as it was daybreak when I woke up. My clothes were wet through, and my coat was covered in blood from my wounded hand. The pain reminded me of all the details of my midnight adventure, and I jumped to my feet with the feeling that even now I might not be safe from my enemies. But to my surprise, when I looked about me, I could see neither the house nor the garden. I had been lying near the side of a country road, and not far off I saw a long, low building. I walked along towards this and found that it was the railway station where I had arrived the night before. Except for the wound on my hand, everything that had happened during those terrible hours might have been a dream. Still only half conscious, I went into the station and asked about the morning train. There would be one to Reading in less than an hour. The same railwayman was on duty as at the time of my arrival. I asked him whether he had ever heard of Captain Lysander Stark. The name was not familiar to him. Had he noticed a carriage waiting for me the night before? No, he had not. Was there a police station anywhere near? There was one 2 or 3 miles away. It was too far for me to go in my weak state. I decided to wait until I got back to London before telling my story to the police. It was about 6:30 when I arrived, and I went first to have my wound bandaged. After that, the doctor very kindly brought me along here. I should like to put the case into your hands, and will do exactly what you advise." Sherlock Holmes and I sat in silence for some moments after listening to this strange account. Then Holmes pulled down from a shelf one of the thick, heavy books in which it was his habit to stick pieces from the newspapers. "Here is an advertisement that will interest you," he said. "It appeared in all the papers about a year ago. Listen to this. Lost on the 9th of this month. Mr. Jeremiah Hayling, 26 years old, an engineer. He left his rooms at 10 o'clock at night and has not been heard of since. He was dressed in and so on. Yes, that must have been the last time the captain needed to have his press repaired, I think." "Good heavens," cried my patient. "Then that explains what the woman said." "I have no doubt of it," said Holmes. "It is quite clear that the captain is a determined man who would not allow anything or anybody to stand in his way. Well, every moment is important, and so, if you feel strong enough, Mr. Hatherley, we will go to Scotland Yard, and then to Aford." 2 hours later, we were all in the train together, on our way from Reading to the little Berkshire village. There were Sherlock Holmes, Mr. Hatherley the engineer, Bradstreet, the Scotland Yard detective, a young policeman, and myself. Bradstreet had spread a large-scale map of the Aford area out on the seat, and was drawing a circle with Aford at its centre. "There," he said. "That circle is 20 miles across. 10 miles from Aford in every direction. The place we want must be somewhere near that line. You said 10 miles, I think, sir?" "The drive took more than an hour," said Mr. Hatherley. "And you think they brought you back all that way while you were unconscious?" "They must have done so. I have a confused memory, too, of having been lifted and carried somewhere. I can't understand why they didn't kill you when they found you in the garden," I said. "Perhaps the woman begged Stark to let you go and succeeded in softening him." "I don't think that very likely," Hatherley answered. "I never saw a more cruel face than his in my life." "Oh, we shall soon find an explanation for all that," said Bradstreet. "Well, I have drawn my circle, but I wish I knew at which point on it the wanted men are to be found." "I think I could put my finger on the right point," said Holmes quietly. "Really?" cried Bradstreet. "So you have formed your opinion? Well then, we shall see who agrees with you. I say it is to the south, as there are very few houses in that direction." "And I say east," said Hatherley. "I think it is to the west," said the second policeman. "There are several quiet little villages up there." "And I think it is to the north," I said, "because there are no hills there, and Mr. Hatherley says that he did not notice the carriage going up any." Bradstreet laughed. "So, we have opinions for north, south, east, and west. Which do you agree with, Mr. Holmes?" "I don't agree with any of them," Holmes answered. "But we can't all be wrong." "Oh, yes, you can. This is my point," he said, placing his finger on the center of the circle. "This is where we shall find them." "But how do you explain the 10-mile drive?" asked Hatherley in surprise. 5 miles out and 5 back. Nothing could be simpler. You said yourself that the horse was quite fresh when you got in. That would be completely impossible if the horse had just gone 10 miles over rough roads." "Yes," said Bradstreet thoughtfully. "It's quite a likely explanation. Of course, it is not difficult to guess what kind of men these are." "Yes," said Holmes. "They are forgers of coins on a large scale. The press is used to form the mixture with which they make a metal that looks like silver. We have known for some time that a clever group was at work," said Bradstreet. "They have made many thousands of forged silver coins. We even had clues which led to Reading. But we could get no further. They had covered their tracks too cleverly. But now I think they are about to fall into our hands." But Bradstreet was mistaken. Those criminals never fell into the hands of the police. As our train came into Aford Station, we saw a broad line of smoke rising into the air behind some trees in the neighborhood of the village. "Is there a house on fire?" Bradstreet asked, as soon as we had got out. "Yes, sir," said the station master. "When did the fire break out?" "I hear that it was during the night, sir, but it has got worse, and by now the house is almost completely destroyed." "Whose house is it?" "Dr. Betcher's." "Tell me," Hatherley interrupted, "is Dr. Betcher a German, very thin, with a long, sharp nose?" The station master laughed loudly. "No, sir. Dr. Betcher is an Englishman, and he's the fattest man in the village. But he has a gentleman staying with him, one of his patients, I believe, who is a foreigner, and he is extremely thin." The station master had not finished speaking before we were all hurrying in the direction of the fire. In front of us on a low hill, there was a large white house. Smoke and flames were coming out of every window, while in the garden, in front, 3 fire engines were attempting, with little success, to control the fire. "That's the house!" cried Hatherley in great excitement. "There are the bushes where I lay, and that second window is the one that I jumped from." "Well, at least," said Holmes, "you have had your revenge on them. I have no doubt that it was your oil lamp which, when it was crushed in the press, set fire to the wooden walls. Though no doubt Stark and Ferguson were too excited by their hunt for you to notice it at the time. Now, keep your eyes open in this crowd for those two men, though I fear that by now they are almost at the other end of England."
And Holmes was right in his guess. From that day to this, nothing has ever been heard of the beautiful woman, the cruel German, or the bad-tempered silent Englishman. Early that morning, a farmer had met a cart containing several people and some very large boxes. They were driving fast in the direction of Reading, but the criminals left no further signs, and even Holmes failed to discover any clues. We learnt that the fireman had found a human thumb, recently cut off, at a window on the second floor of the house. At about sunset they succeeded in putting the fire out, but by that time the roof had fallen in, and almost nothing remained of the forger's machinery inside the house. Large amounts of different metals were found in a building behind the house, but it was clear that the criminals had taken their stores of forged coins away with them in the boxes. The mystery of how Mr. Hatherley had been carried from the garden to the roadside was quickly solved when Holmes found a double line of footprints in the soft earth. The engineer had been carried out by two people, one of whom had very small feet, and the other unusually large ones. On the whole, it was most likely that the silent Englishman, less fearless or less cruel than the German captain, had helped the woman to carry the unconscious man out of the way of danger.
"Well," said Hatherley a little sadly, "it has been a strange affair for me. I have lost my thumb, and I have lost £50 in pay. And what have I gained?" "You have gained experience," said Holmes, laughing. "And you have now got a true and interesting story of your own, which you will be able to tell every day for the rest of your life."